Hello, thank you for joining us for States Tackle Transportation and Traffic Safety. This is certainly an exciting and momentous time in transportation and traffic safety policy. We have a lot of technological advancements that are occurring now that will really radically reshape transportation in the United States and around the globe in the next 20 to 30 years. Obviously, looking the furthest out, thinking about autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles are real. They are here in the United States and they are being tested, and in some cases actually being deployed and carrying passengers or freight in the United States as we speak. So an incredibly exciting time. Autonomous vehicles have the potential to bring enhanced mobility to people such as people that don't own vehicles and perhaps people with disabilities. At the same time that we have this growth towards switching to autonomy, governments and industry are also taking a number of big steps to electrify the transportation sector. As some of you may know, California issued an executive order recently mandating that all vehicles sold in the state starting in 2035 must be no emissions. General Motors announced a goal that their light duty vehicles would be electric, or plug-in hybrid by the same year, 2035. Now, only 2% of the current American vehicle fleet is electric vehicles, but Bloomberg analysts predict that will increase to about 30% of all vehicle sales by 2030 and about 60% by 2040. And alongside electrification, we also have another exciting trend, which is kind of the shared mobility or mobility on demand. Obviously, companies like Uber, Lyft, and Lime are already out there, and some of those services are going to be incorporated with autonomy in the future. But I want to be clear, there's a lot of exciting things going on in the transportation and traffic safety policy space, but states are still grappling with the same challenges that have been vexing them for decades. The first one probably is, how to pay for all this in an environment where gas taxes are declining, likely to never regain their former taxing prowess. Many states are getting creative and looking for different options, and doing a pretty good job of shoring up those deficits in the short term. But in the long term, many states are studying the concept of a road user charge, or RUC, that can charge motorists based on the miles they drive. And really, that's going to be one of the fundamental challenges in the next decade in transportation policy, is how to supplement and eventually replace the gas tax system. The other big challenge is one that's been kind of a persistent challenge for decades, really since the advent of the internal combustion engine, traffic safety. There have been between 32 to 37,000 deaths annually on American roadways over the next decade. And progress to drive the number of deaths down has been difficult. And states are trying, they're implementing new laws, they're refining programs, they're trying different enforcement techniques, they're working with their local partners to do all this. But making improvements in reducing these number of deaths has been difficult. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. So with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Douglas Schinkel. I am the Transportation Program Director at the National Conference of State Legislatures, NCSL for short. What is NCSL? Well, NCSL is basically a membership organization that is here to serve you, the state legislatures. And that means the newly elected state lawmakers who are with us today, and so happy to have you here. Congratulations. I feel like you're drinking from the fire hose, a lot of information to bring in, to take in, but we're here to help. And we're also here to help the legislative staff and the legislatures that support you. So you're all entitled to our services. NCSL is headquartered in Denver, and we have an office in DC that does our federal lobbying work, and we'll hear a little bit about that later. I do want to know, we're trying to bite off a lot in this conversation today. We're trying to talk about transportation and traffic safety. And there's a lot of things that we won't specifically talk about, say transit, public-private partnerships, freight, aviation, ports and waterways. We're not going to get an opportunity today to go into all those issues, but that does not mean that we cannot be helpful to you. So if you need assistance with research, we can do that. If you have an idea for some future programming that you'd like to see, we'll be taking some polls throughout, and those will help inform our future meetings like this and what kind of topics we should talk about. So before we dive into the policy context, let's quickly review the webinar functionality. So to the right of the video player, you will note tabs that say chat and Q&A. If you want to ask me and the other speakers a question, please use the Q&A tab. Please make sure to include your full name and your state and title in the nickname box when prompted in the chat. That will increase the likelihood your question will be asked. If you see a question you like, you can upvote it by hitting the up arrow. You can expand the video player to full screen by clicking on the arrows at the bottom right of the player window. Find the speaker bios and resources related to this section directly below the video player. And if you aren't able to watch any part of this, these will be available through March 26th. Lastly, if you need any help, there is a help tab down towards the bottom right of the page, and please click on that. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the run of show and what we're going to discuss in the agenda today. A little bit of, there we go, sorry about that. So we're going to talk about many of the same dynamics that I already discussed in the opening remarks: transportation funding, traffic safety, autonomous vehicles, and federal transportation update. I'll be talking about transportation funding, then we'll hear from our partner at the Centers for Disease Control, Aaron Saber-Schatz, to fill us in on the latest with traffic safety. I'll come back to talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles, and then we'll hear from my federal colleague, Ben Hush, about what's going on in Capitol Hill with regards to transportation. Lots of news there for sure. So first slide, let's maybe set the scene a little bit. So this chart from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy demonstrates two of the main factors squeezing state transportation budgets. So the top line you'll see is the construction costs and the estimates for the future. And the reality is that these continue to rise. Construction of roadways and of transportation infrastructure continues to increase. At the same time, you see this line on the bottom, the red line, and that's the fuel efficiency, the projected fuel efficiency of the American vehicle fleet. And you see that increasing significantly as well. This is a chart from the transportation finance experts at CDM Smith. The red line shows what expected kind of gas tax revenue would be if nothing changed with the mileage of the American vehicle fleet. We all know, I think that's unlikely to occur though. And what you see with the green and the orange lines down at the bottom are two different projections of electric vehicle penetration into the market. And what you see is that the gap between the revenue that we would have expected to be able to take in the past and the reality of what it probably will look like. These are projections, so we don't know exactly what it'll look like, but we're looking at a situation where we have a $15 billion deficit nationally by 2025, which is, clearly not very far off, 25 billion by 2030. So you can see this widening gulf, and it's difficult for states to deal with. It's really represented in this slide, which is kind of fascinating to see what's happened just since 2000. So in 2000, 55% of state highway program revenues came from user fees and tolls and taxes. This includes gas tax and other user fees. And now it's down to 42%. And that mostly has a lot to do with the fact that the gas tax, vehicles just aren't using as much fuel, and so as much gas isn't being purchased. Now, states are trying to supplement that by increasing other sources, and states have got really creative. They've been using general fund dollars, sales taxes. A couple states like Missouri and Arkansas have some money dedicated specifically to go to transportation funds. Lottery proceeds have been used, tobacco taxes and mineral royalties. In fact, a 2016 report done by NCSL in partnership with AASHTO found that states tap over 50 different sources of funding to pay for their transportation systems. Now, the federal gas tax is a very important point. Ben, my colleague, will go into this a little bit as well, but federal gas tax has not gone up since 1993, and it has been stuck at that 18.4 cents for a long time. What that has meant is that that's more pressure on states essentially to make sure that they can raise revenue on their end without more money coming from the federal government. And states have responded. I mean, 30 states have increased their gas taxes since 2013, and actually a couple instances states have done it twice in that time frame. And furthermore, 22 states and Washington, D.C. have now indexed their gas taxes, meaning they some way track with the economy. They're usually linked with either the CPI, population growth, or sometimes the wholesale or rack price of gasoline. So states have been assertive about doing this because they've been kind of forced into a corner. And so we'll kind of see what develops over the next couple of years. So something else that I'm anticipating a lot of you will have to grapple with legislatures is you have more vehicles on the road that are not using gas or using very little gas. And how do you capture that money that would be going in the transportation system that's now being lost? Now, obviously, there's some trade-offs here because part of the point of some of these low and no fuel emission vehicles is that they're going to help reduce transportation emissions, which make up about 28% of emissions overall in the United States. But at the end of the day, we still have to pay for the transportation infrastructure we have. And these cars still have to drive on the same roads. And so lots of states have turned to having fees, additional registration fees on top of the vehicle registration fees an owner would already pay that go towards the transportation fund. So 28 states have a fee on electric vehicles, plug-in electric vehicles, while 14 states have a fee on plug-in hybrid vehicles. Those fees for electric vehicles, for example, range from $50 in Colorado and Hawaii to $225 in Washington state. And we expect to see a lot more states considering this year. So given the predicted increase in low and no fuel vehicles and everything that's going on with the pressures on the gas tax system, states are increasingly looking for new forms of revenue and particularly new user fees to supplement and perhaps eventually possibly replace the gas tax system that has served us so well over the years. Many policymakers and stakeholders are now seriously considering the concept of a road user charge, like I said, a RUC. Those are also known as a VMT fee or a mileage-based user fee, mileage-based user fee, MBUF. The federal government has supported this effort via a federal program called the Surface Transportation System Funding's Alternative Program, and NCSL actually played a role in getting this grant program in place, and my colleague Ben can perhaps talk about that a little bit. But that's just been able to seed money to states to try different innovative user fee approaches. States have been trying some different things, some of them attaching them with registration fees rather than a charge on actually the miles driven, but mostly states are gravitating towards this RUC model. So here's the RUC state of play across the country. The polka dot states, Oregon and Utah, are the only two states with an operational program, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a moment. Virginia is actually going to be joining them with an operational program, I think sometime in the next year or so, as mandated by legislation, so we'll keep an eye on that as well. And as you can see, there's a lot of states at least monitoring this issue, if not studying it and piloting it. And you'll see the examples where you see the yellow arrows on the map. Those are states that are studying interoperability. Because what happens when you're in your car in Oregon and you cross the river into Vancouver, Washington, and you're all of a sudden in a different state? Do you get charged for your miles in that state? How does Washington capture that money? So at some point, this is going to have to move to more of a regional level. But right now, there's a lot of exciting work going on at the state level to see what's going on. And really, these states are just trying to explore all the issues that go with this. How do you track and report these miles? How do you in some states, you know, like in some state, California, they're considering odometer readings. Hawaii, they're considering odometer readings. In Oregon, they only currently have two vehicle reporting options, and they're both in the vehicle plug-in devices. But they can capture your GPS or not capture your GPS. If they don't capture your GPS, well, then your privacy is more being preserved. But then you might be charged for miles when you drive on a private road or when you drive in another state. So there are some trade-offs here. So states are trying to work through kind of all these options and figure that out. Now, NCSL has developed a webpage specifically on all this because there is really starting to be an explosion of activity around this. And we'll eventually have fact sheets for all the states that have received those federal grants to do pilots and studies. And so keep on looking back at that page for updates throughout the year. And one of my colleagues should have shared to the chat over there. So lastly, let's focus on Oregon and Utah at the moment, because it's sometimes, it's momentous. Like I said, this is an exciting time in transportation. We have these two programs that are real, that are actually charging by the mile. Now, they're both really pretty small at the moment, but they're starting to figure out the issues, and they're starting to get drivers into these programs. And one of the key similarities between Utah and Oregon is that both states are increasing these registration fees, these enhanced registration fees for hybrid and electric vehicles, to levels where they're basically saying you either pay this fee or you go into the RUC program. And if you go in the RUC program, then you don't have to pay this fee. So actually, in kind of newer news from Utah is now looking at increasing their fees. You see on here that the fee is currently $120. They're proposing having the fee go up to $400. Is that right? $300, and also increasing the hybrid fee. So this gives you kind of a cross comparison of what's going on here. Oregon utilizes two private firms and as well as the Oregon Department of Transportation to offer reporting and payment services. And that was a way to try at getting at, like, maybe some consumers don't want to share their information with the government, or they don't want to share it with a private vendor. So giving them those options. And the price per mile is about the same in both states so far, 1.8 in Oregon and 1.5 in Utah. So with that, let's stop and actually take the first poll question. So please look below you and look for poll number 1. And it said, the question poses, which transportation topic would you like to learn more about? And so if you could go down there and take that poll now, and I'll kind of monitor the responses as they come in a moment, and we'll see what things look like. We'll wait one more second to see if any more responses come in. Okay, they're starting to populate now. Give me one more second. So seeing a lot of interest in road user charging and other alternatives to the gas tax. Very good to know, something that we've definitely been focusing on of late. Smaller percentages for the streamlining project approval processes and the transportation project selection. We do have some good information there if people are interested. Transit funding is at about 17. So we're at now road user charging, 33% of responses. I think you all can see it. I'm looking off my phone here. And then pretty even for a lot of other things. Good to know that there's interest in active transportation and micromobility, and in thinking about transportation emissions, something we're hoping to do more with NCSL's environment and energy programs on, but really interesting information here. So I think we're going to move on now, and we're going to move to Erin Saber-Schatz with the Centers for Disease Control. She's going to join us. Hello, Erin.
Hello.
To discuss traffic safety and give us an overview of kind of what's going on and some of the promising interventions out there to help reduce traffic deaths. Erin serves as the team lead of the Transportation Safety Team in the Division of Injury Prevention at CDC's Injury Center. She will, and like I said, she'll provide an overview. And with that, Erin, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Doug. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk to you. Doug, can you pull up the slides? So as we're getting the slides pulled up, one question I will often get is, why is CDC working in transportation safety? And one thing that I always let people know is that CDC's mission is to work 24/7 to protect America from health, safety, and security threats. So within the CDC, we're the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So one of those centers is the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. And so we focus in on the various types of injury that affect people's ability to live well, that kill thousands of people every single year, and also contribute to more morbidity. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So I wanted to start off with, sorry, just moving my little picture, I don't need to see myself, with the burden of motor vehicle crashes. So when you think about motor vehicle crashes, oftentimes you'll just hear about the number of deaths in a year. Motor vehicle crashes are a leading cause of death among those aged 1 through 54 in the United States. So given the significant burden on health that motor vehicle crashes contribute to deaths in the US every year is part of the reason that CDC is involved in this space in the Injury Center. So there are roughly 38,000 deaths every single year in the United States. So that's over 100 people every day dying in crashes. And in addition to the deaths, there are more than 2.7 million injuries treated in emergency departments every year. And that translates into $55 billion in medical and work loss costs in the year 2018. So at CDC, when we talk about motor vehicle crashes, we talk about the full impact of a crash. So for every one person killed in a crash, 9 people are hospitalized and 81 people are treated and released from emergency departments. So that also contributes to the significant burden on the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So given that I had this opportunity to talk to all of you today and new lawmakers, I wanted to talk about some of the major risk factors for crashes, injuries, and deaths. And often we talk about the big three. The third of the big three is actually not on this slide, but the big three are lack of restraint use, impaired driving, and speed. At CDC, we don't spend as much focus on speed because that is a local issue, but speed definitely kills and contributes to almost a third of the crash deaths every year. So on the slide, I have lack of restraint use. So about half of people who died in 2018 were not buckled up at the time of fatal crash. So even though you might see in your state that the observational surveys that are done show a high percentage of seatbelt use, of the people who die, only half of them are buckled up. Alcohol impaired driving is another one of the big three. So in 2018, 29% of all traffic related deaths in the United States were related to alcohol impaired driving. This translates into more than 10,500 people dying in alcohol impaired crashes every year. The other point that we wanted to bring up, because there's a lot of attention around teen drivers in state, is teen drivers. They're less experienced, they're learning how to drive, and per mile driven, teen drivers age 16 to 19 have nearly 3 times as likely as drivers 20 and older to be in a fatal crash. And more than 2,000 teens aged 16 to 19 die in crashes every year. Next slide, please. Doug, next slide, please. Thanks. So when thinking about restraints and alcohol being 2 of the big major contributors to motor vehicle crashes, there are policies and strategies out there that have been proven to be effective to increase restraint use. These include primary seatbelt laws that cover all seating positions. And the important for policies that cover all seating positions is that we know that people are more likely to buckle in the front versus the back seat. But regardless, in states that have primary seatbelt enforcement versus secondary seatbelt enforcement, there's a higher use of seatbelts. So the difference between primary enforcement and secondary enforcement, all states except for New Hampshire have a seatbelt law, but it's different in how they're enforced. So primary enforcement means a law enforcement officer could pull someone over simply for not wearing a seatbelt, where secondary enforcement means that there has to be some other infraction before a police officer could pull somebody over for not wearing their seatbelt. Other effective strategies for increasing restraint use include increasing penalties for seatbelt violations, short-term high visibility enforcement, so you can think of click it or ticket, integrated nighttime enforcement programs, so we know that seatbelt use goes down at night, and also child passenger restraint laws that require proper car seat and booster seat use until at least age 9. Other program strategies include distribution plus education programs that provide new and unused car seats and education on how to properly use them. These have been shown to be effective to increase the use of car seats. And also incentive and education programs that reward parents or children with coupons or other prizes for correctly using car seats. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So the next set that I'd like to talk about are the strategies to reduce alcohol impaired driving. So policy strategies include alcohol impaired driving laws. In the United States, Utah is the state that has gone down to a 0.05 BAC. Other states have BACs of 0.08. Compared to other high-income countries that have 0.05 BACs, the United States is a little bit lagging in this recommendation to have a 0.05 BAC. It has been shown to be effective at reducing the number of people who drive while impaired and also reducing deaths. Of course, zero tolerance laws for people less than 21 years of age. This is also critical to help with the teen driving issue. And then minimum drinking age laws at 21. Also publicize sobriety checkpoints and high visibility saturation patrols. And ignition interlocks for all, including first-time convicted offenders. So for anyone who doesn't know, an ignition interlock is a device that goes on a vehicle where the driver would have to blow a less than, usually less than 0.02 BAC for the ignition to actually turn over and the car to start. And then we have other program strategies such as alcohol problem assessment, alcohol screening and brief interventions, and multiple component interventions. So one study that CDC did using the Florida mandate for people who were locked out of their ignition interlock to be mandated to substance abuse treatment showed a reduction in recidivism after treatment. So knowing that alcoholism is a disease, thinking about how to actually get people who are repeat offenders of impaired driving into treatment programs has been shown to be effective to later reduce recidivism. Next slide, please. Okay, while we're waiting for the slide to move, I will go ahead and start talking about strategies to reduce teen driver crashes and deaths. So one of the policy strategies that has been really effective at saving our teens on the road is graduated driver's licensing systems. So often called GDL systems, it's a 3-stage policy that includes a learner's permit, and we have the recommended levels for the graduated driver's licensing listed on the slide with a minimum age of 16 years and a mandatory holding period of at least 12 months. The second stage is intermediate or provisional license. And in this, we recommend restrictions against nighttime driving between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. For everyone driving at night is more dangerous, and that includes teens. And a limit of 0 or 1 for the number of young passengers without adult supervision. So we know that having distractions in the car, including other passengers, can increase the risk of teen crashes. Next slide, please. So that was a lightning speed overview of some of the different policies and strategies that have been shown to be effective at reducing motor vehicle crashes, injuries, and deaths. And so I wanted to let you all know that these information on these different strategies are available in state-based fact sheets that CDC just released at the end of last year. Doug, I'm on the next slide with new state-based fact sheets. And Ollie says hello. Our new state-based fact sheets are for all 50 states and Washington, D.C. It covers alcohol impaired driving, restraint use, including child passenger safety, and distracted driving. So these are state-specific tools and state-specific fact sheets. So whichever state you're in, you can pull these up. It describes the deaths or the specific topic that it covers in your state compared to the nation. And based on the policies you have in place, we make recommendations for what things could be, what different policies could be put into place to reduce motor vehicle crashes, injuries, and deaths. So again, we have these for alcohol impaired driving, for restraint use, and also the cost of crash deaths. Knowing sometimes that the number of people who die on the road or injured will not always convince people to put policies into place that are effective, we highlight the cost of crash deaths that the states are losing due to these deaths in medical costs and lost productivity. Again, each state has state-specific data and information about effective strategies. Next slide, please. And I'll go through the next slide quickly. We also have topic-specific fact sheets that are available. We have drug impaired driving and distracted driving. So these are nice overviews of the issue as a whole. And each fact sheet has the overview of the topic as well as promising strategies that states can use. Next slide. Another focus at CDC is data linkage. So my training is in epidemiology. That's what my PhD is in. So we love data. And many states have not actually linked their data so that they can have a full understanding of what happens before, during, and after a crash. But by linking data, you can better understand the risk factors for the crash, what happened during the crash, and then post-crash, what are the actual medical and health outcomes of the crash. And so we have a links guide, which helps the state go through the process of linking information for non-fatal crash surveillance. We have a data linkage fact sheet that we just released, and we talk through the different benefits of state data linkage. So there are states out there that are models for data linkage, including Utah and Maryland, Ohio, and Kentucky. So they really have come a long way with data linkage, and other states are moving in this direction to better understand the risks and outcomes of motor vehicle crashes. Next slide, please. And also for your awareness, we have a data-driven tool called Mvpx. So this is an online calculator that includes 14 different proven motor vehicle interventions that you can put in place in your state. And what it does is it selects from a suite of those 14 effective motor vehicle interventions, and it calculates the number of expected lives that would be saved if you put these interventions into place, as well as the monetized value of injuries prevented and lives saved, and the cost of implementation while taking into account available resources. So you can go in, put your budget. The tool will help you determine which interventions could be put into place. It will tell you how many lives you could save, how much it would cost you, and how many dollars you would save. Next slide, please. And I believe you all will be getting copies of these slides, but the next couple of slides are just about other resources that we have available for at CDC for transportation safety, including we have a whole suite of tribal motor vehicle injury prevention materials. We have information about, we have 23 states funded by CDC to do this court state violence and injury prevention program that is listed at the bottom of the slide. And then the final slide is just where to find CDC fact sheets and guides. So the links for those as well. And just in closing, I just wanted to let people know that there's another large initiative in the United States that is a collaborative called the Road to Zero. So the goal is getting to zero road traffic deaths by 2050. There are 3 pillars to this approach, including doubling down on what works, advancing technology, and prioritizing safety. It's run out of the National Safety Council, but includes a whole collaboration of people across the United States, and currently has over 1,500 coalition members. Similarly, your state might have Vision Zero or Towards Zero Deaths. So those are other good places to get connected for traffic safety. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that. Apologies for the snafu. The slides were being a little sticky when I was advancing them, so sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Sorry for my cat.
No, that was good.
I fed him before thinking he would leave me alone, but apparently not.
Yeah, cats have a mind of their own for sure. Thank you for all the information you presented, giving a good overview of the issues and sharing all the resources that CDC has. CDC is one of many partners that NCSL has, and they've been invaluable to us over the years and providing with research that we then pass on to lawmakers. And I would really tout that Mvpx tool. It's a really neat thing, and the fact that you can personalize it to your state and choose different interventions and see what the cost is or how much fine revenue you might get back. It's really exciting. So let's now take the traffic safety poll and gauge where the audience is in terms of their level of interest in these topics. So if once again, go below, and which traffic safety topic would you like to learn more about? And in the meantime, we're going to have Samantha Block with NCSL join us as well. Say hello, Samantha.
Hello, everyone.
Samantha is works in our transportation program as well and is our traffic safety expert on a number of issues. So let's see the responses roll in. And Samantha, can you see them over on your side? Oh, wow.
No, I can't.
Okay, I will relay them to everyone. And Aaron, do you want to share your unmute yourself and share your video too, Aaron, so you can weigh in on this?
Yes, absolutely.
So Justin, we'll give it a minute. So the options, once again, alcohol impaired driving, drug or / poly substance impaired driving, distracted driving, seatbelts and child passenger protection, pedestrian and bicycle safety, and speed limits / automated enforcement. So let's see what we have here. A lot of interest in speed limits and automated enforcement, which is really interesting. Pedestrian and bicyclist safety, that's something that's been one of the areas that's been really difficult for states to deal with. Made a lot of progress with in-vehicle safety, but the people that aren't in the vehicle are the one whose death rates and tend to have gone up, especially in the last decade. And then now it's looking like it's a tie between drug driving and speed limits and automated enforcement. Samantha, I wonder if you could maybe share for a minute kind of what's going on in the states with regards to drug impaired driving, especially given what's going on with the legalization of marijuana, but also what's going on with poly substance impaired driving, and maybe briefly explain what that is and what some of the things that states are doing there to kind of move beyond just focusing on alcohol impaired, but also thinking about drug and polysubstance impaired.
Yes, polysubstance impaired driving is generally understood as driving under the influence of either a combination of drugs and alcohol or a mix of drugs. And there has definitely been an increase in drug and polysubstance impaired driving before COVID, but we have seen data that suggests that things have become worse during the pandemic. And what I have seen states like try to do to combat drug and polysubstance impaired driving is trying to enact per se laws, or trying to look into different testing methods, such as oral fluid testing methods, but also expanding sobriety and drug monitoring programs and in establishing treatment programs. So I can maybe during the Q&A go a little bit into more depth into these areas, but that's what I have seen from the state side.
I appreciate that. Aaron, do you want to add anything from your perspective about what CDC is researching with regards to polysubstance and drug impaired driving?
Yeah, sure. So within the Injury Center, we have the Division of Overdose Prevention. So we work closely hand in hand with the opioid epidemic subject matter experts at CDC. In addition, we have been working on keeping an eye on cannabis and the legalization of marijuana across the states. Of course, polysubstance impaired driving continues to be an issue, especially as more states are legalizing marijuana. But we have to remember that 1/3 of the deaths are attributed to alcohol impaired driving. So yes, polysubstance is still an issue. It might becoming more of one, but we have effective interventions right now that could be further applied in states to get alcohol impaired driving down. That being said, there is a big debate about per se laws. There are so many variables that go into how someone reacts when they use marijuana, whether they're a novice user or a chronic user. It depends on the potency of the cannabis that they use. And in addition, there's a really great report to Congress that I believe was published in 2017 by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that does a really nice job of laying out the difference between how you test for alcohol and how you test for THC in the blood. So there's a huge spike in THC about 15 minutes after someone has used, and then the THC level goes way down. But when that THC level is way down, that is when you're actually at your heightened level of impairment. So the actual content that you measure in the blood does not match your level of impairment. So there are a lot of actual issues around having a per se law. And so I think that if that is something that you are considering in your state, reach out. There are a lot of experts that have been looking into this topic and can advise you one way or the other. I will also say that Colorado and Washington were the pioneers in this and have strong opinions and feelings and lessons learned that I'm sure they'd be willing to share. Over.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. We've had Colorado and Washington highlighted in a lot of our conversations, obviously over the 5 or 6 years since they got a head start with legalizing things. So then they also were dealing with some of the negative ramifications. Aaron, I appreciate you pointing out, you can't keep your eyes off the prize that alcohol impaired driving is still a very big problem. So let's make sure that any focus on this doesn't distract from that. And appreciate you explaining the toxology a little bit. So I think we'll maybe let's stop here. So let's see what we can get in terms of questions at the end. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us, and we'll see you again at the Q. We will do full Q&A at the end, so we'll have Aaron and Samantha return. And with that, I'll kind of move on with the rest of the presentation. So now I'm going to provide you with a quick overview of state legislative activity regarding autonomous vehicles, or I might call them AVs for short. Let me just. So many vehicle manufacturers and states are taking note of something that was said, of this general concept that was said by Bryant Walker Smith, who is a legal expert at the University of South Carolina and someone we've had at a lot of NCSL meetings. He pointed out that current law probably does not prohibit automated vehicles, but it may nonetheless discourage their introduction or complicate their operation. I think that's a good way to put it. So legislatures are kind of taking differing approaches. I would say they're focusing on collecting information and bringing together stakeholders, putting in place basic definitional terms, and authorizing testing and the requirements that have to be met in order to test in a state. Overall, 36 states and DC have enacted legislation related to AVs. You can kind of see this from its chart here, split up in a couple different categories. Governors in 11 states have issued executive orders. So probably the topic of the most interest to states is determining whether or not to formally legalize companies to test AVs in their state, or if you want to come up with some other system that's not formally legalizing it in statute, but still allowing driverless vehicle companies to come into your state and test. Many states are eager to look into this. It comes with a lot of potential economic development possibilities when you bring these kind of companies to your state. And the rules really run the gamut from a more kind of hands-off approach in a state like Arizona and Florida to a stricter approach in California. Now, note that some states don't even have laws on the books governing such testing. One example is Arizona, where the executive orders have driven the process. Notably, one thing I want to share is that one of the opportunities that NCSL has is the ability to go on tours and to meet from some of your peers in the legislature, but also to meet some of the movers and shakers in industry or academia. And actually, about 1.5 years ago, we traveled down to Phoenix, and Waymo is one of the autonomous vehicle companies out there, and they're kind of the leader, I think it's probably fair to say at the moment. And they actually have a ride sharing program in the Southeast Phoenix metro area now. So you can now go to Southeast Phoenix. And if you're in that area, kind of Chandler, Mesa in that area, you can actually summon one of these vehicles and you will be picked up by an autonomous vehicle. Now, there may be a safety driver in it. The safety driver may even be driving it. But in most instances, they're not driving it. In some instances, you will get in the vehicle now and there won't be anyone in it at all. But we were able to go down there and bring a group of lawmakers about 1.5 years ago and see firsthand what's going on with autonomous testing and get kind of a flavor of it, in reality. And so those are the kind of exciting opportunities when we can travel again that we hope we can return to. So there's this kind of debate. Do you want to have a deliberate strategy? Not putting something in the law is maybe a deliberate strategy to create a permissive and welcoming regulatory environment, but it might also make sense to put things in laws. Florida is another state that has a relatively more permissive and open regulatory structure, but they did put things in. They did put most of it into statute. And that's an example of one of the states where these vehicles can be tested out there without a driver in the vehicle. And note that many state AV testing regimes are typically run through their state departments of transportation, but that's not always the case. Now, as you can see, a number of states have convened work groups and task forces to study AV technology and the regulatory environment to determine what type of legislation or regulation is appropriate in their state. There's really a dizzying array of stakeholders that need to be included in these discussions. So establishing such groups can be a good way to start the information collection process and analyzing that information. Many of these groups include representatives from industry, academics, various users of the transportation system, and of course, impacted state agencies. For example, the Minnesota Governor's Advisory Council on Connected and Autonomous Vehicles has ex officio members from the Departments of Agriculture, Revenue, Employment and Economic Development, Public Safety, the Minnesota Council on Disability, et cetera. So a lot of people that have some sort of stake in the system and need to make sure that it's formulated in a way that works for all people and is, hopefully improving our transportation outcomes. So insurance, a 2014 study by IHS Automotive noted that the two major technology risks for autonomous vehicles are software reliability and cybersecurity. Software reliability could lead to a car malfunctioning and running over a person or crashing into another car or object. Cybersecurity could mean the car is hijacked and is used in some way to harm people. 24 states have specific insurance liability laws for AVs. And the customary, well, not the customary, but the most common minimum liability amount is the $5 million, the $5 million that you see in this slide here. But it is noteworthy that some states are stepping away from stricter insurance requirements for autonomous vehicles. Georgia and New Hampshire are just going to a system where essentially it's the same insurance as it is for other vehicles. So a lot of things that are going on here. There wasn't a lot of activity in legislatures last year because of the COVID pandemic, but there's certainly a lot of activity still going on in states with testing, and the DOTs. Encourage you to connect with your liaisons at the DOT if you're interested in some of that, and they'll be able to point you in the right direction. And so with that, let's pause real quick and let's take another poll. So once again, look below you, look for poll number 3, and that is asking, which aspect of autonomous vehicles would you like to learn more about? And the choices are testing of autonomous vehicles on public roads, insurance considerations, safety and interaction with other road users, coordination with transit and shared mobility, infrastructure and technology requirements, which I didn't get really into too much, and cybersecurity concerns. So let me take a moment and see what the results look like. Continuing to populate, looking like testing is definitely of interest, safety and infrastructure. And I would say safety and infrastructure definitely, I mean, this all goes together, but safety and infrastructure definitely are connected. I didn't talk a lot about connected vehicle technology, but there are states that come to mind. Certainly Ohio and Utah are known as 2 leaders in this regard that are doing a lot of their testing that's around the communication between traffic infrastructure, essentially like lights, signage, paint on the roadways, ways to make sure that the vehicle can identify all of that properly. And then some cases with like traffic lights, communicate with them, which can improve efficiency. It can also cut down on crashes and what have you. So a lot of interesting stuff there. So looking like testing at 29%, now it's equal to testing. So insurance is a big topic of conversation. NCSL does have an insurance task force, so I will let them know that. And this gives me a good sense of where we're at. Let me take a quick look at the chat questions, and let me see what we should do anything. I think let's move on to Ben's converse to Ben. Ben, do you want to join us here? I want to welcome my colleague, Ben Hush. Hello, Ben. He is our federal counsel on natural resources and infrastructure based in our DC office. Ben, were you able to see, based on what I said, basically, we're showing testing, insurance, and safety and infrastructure considerations as the ones that are garnering the most attention. Any thoughts based on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the takeaway that I would the takeaway that I have from how even the responses are is how broad-based the concerns and questions are about what AVs will mean for, society at large. There's still such a new technology, so there's still so many questions. There's not one specific issue that everyone's like, we have to solve this right now. It's just still such an unknown. But at the same time, the potential benefits are so great that I think everyone kind of wants the automation to be here now.
Yep, I would completely concur with that. I think what it shows is there's a lot to learn still, right? And
yep.
These, as I referenced, you were able to travel in this Waymo vehicle too. It's exciting to see what's going on, but it's a lot to take in. So there's a lot out there. And I think you're going to talk about this a little bit in your presentation now. So why don't I turn it over to you? There's a lot going on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of things that are very consequential to how states kind of do business when it comes to transportation and traffic safety at the federal level. And Ben is so well read on all of that and is going to go over that now. So I will turn it over to you, Ben, and then I'll come back on the flip side when we do the last poll question.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Doug. And it's great to meet everyone, or meet everyone kind of in this environment. And I just want to reiterate what Doug said earlier. Thank you so much for your service, and of course taking time out of your Friday to join us here. All right, so let's jump right into it. So I've broken down my discussion into 3 parts, and to start, I'm going to give just a quick kind of 101 transportation overview. I'm going to spend a little bit of time walking through kind of why it's so hard for Congress to pass a large infrastructure bill. And then I'm going to just finish up with just a quick mention of kind of the transportation aid that we've seen in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So first up, we have roads and transit. Now, why am I starting with roads and transit? Well, that's because every year the federal government sends states and localities about $60 billion for road and transit projects. And the other important piece of that is that these funds that the states and localities receive, they get to choose what projects they want to use them on. While the federal government might have specific standards for different projects, the projects that are actually constructed or the maintenance efforts, those are chosen by state and local governments. So the Federal Highway Association, or FHWA, and the Federal Transit Administration, or FTA, these are the 2 most important sub-agencies, or as we tend to refer to them, modal administrations. And of course, that's because of all the funds that they send to states. Now, federal highways, they run 5 major core programs that send funds to states via formula funding, while the FTA, they generally about twice as many programs. And while most of those are formula, their largest program is actually discretionary, in that the projects that are funded are actually chosen by DOT. Now, formula funding is so important for states because it allows them to plan ahead for multi-year projects. I mean, if you think of large infrastructure projects, it's not something that happens overnight. It often can take multiple years or potentially multiple construction seasons. So in addition to these core programs, I also want to mention the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration. I know Aaron mentioned it earlier, but I want to point out that they actually run 2 additional programs for states to help promote traffic safety, and everything from graduated driver's licenses to distracted driving to impaired driving. So those are some really important programs for states to help address a number of traffic safety issues. Both NHTSA and a separate agency, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which of course deals with motor carriers, these are agencies at the federal level that are going to work very extensively with your state DMV. So now I'd like to spend a quick minute kind of talking about a few other areas within DOT that aren't really necessarily set up to send or spend a significant amount of federal funds to state governments, but they have a significant impact on states in the regulatory aspect. So Doug, if you could go to the next slide so I can mention the first one up, we have Federal Aviation Administration. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's in the news pretty often. They regulate air transportation, everything from passenger and freight. But of course, one of the new kind of areas is drones. And again, while the agency does provide some funding to states and airports, its impact is much more on the regulatory side. For rail, we have the Federal Railroad Administration. Again, regulate passenger and freight rail. Although outside of Amtrak, there isn't a huge passenger rail service in the United States, though we do have a very significant freight rail sector that is operated and maintained by the private sector. Amtrak, of course, plays a major role in interstate air travel through its national network, the Northeast Corridor, and of course, state-supported routes. And what I mean by that are there are some states that pay Amtrak to operate certain shorter routes that are kind of intra-state routes. For water transportation, we actually have to step outside of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So if we're focusing on the inland waterway system or our systems of ports and harbors, you actually have to go more to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because that's where the funding for construction and maintenance projects occur. So I mentioned at the start of this, and Doug, if you could just scroll to the next slide for me. I mentioned at the start that the difficulty that Congress has in passing transportation infrastructure legislation. I mean, it seems like this is a topic that you always hear about and somehow never goes away. So currently those roads and transit programs that I mentioned a minute ago, they are authorized by what is known as the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or as we just refer to it, the FAST Act. It was passed in 2015. It was originally a 5-year bill, although last September it was extended for another year because Congress was unable to agree on how to reauthorize it. So what makes transportation such a hard bill to pass? Well, I would point to 2 primary reasons. The first and most obvious is the money. And there is this belief, kind of right or wrong, that surface transportation infrastructure bills should be paid for, in that the revenue in equals the revenue that equals the spending that Congress decides to approve. However, if you remember what Doug mentioned earlier when he first kind of opened the presentation, is that the gas tax hasn't been increased in nearly 30 years. And I'm sure that there are many, many things that all of you can think about in terms of what the price was in 1993 versus what it is now. I think the most obvious one that comes to me is when I was a kid, how much it cost to go to the movies versus how much it costs to rent a movie now. And on the flip side, Congress hasn't necessarily stopped increasing how much money it spends. And so, as you can see in that chart, the amount of money in continues to kind of stay the same while the amount of money out continues to go up. The second reason, and this is a little inside baseball, but I think it's important, is how diffuse the process is for this, this major sector of the federal government. And what I mean by that is, in the Senate alone, there are 4 different committees that have a piece of this bill. So you have the Environment and Public Works Committee, you have the Commerce Committee, you have the Banking Committee, which oversees transit, and then you have the Finance Committee. So each of those committees has to approve their own section before a full bill can come to the floor. So a lot of work to do, and we hope to see a reauthorization of the FAST Act later this year. So I want to spend a minute or two kind of now with a new Congress and a new president, the upcoming expiration that I just mentioned, and what you hear in the news is, okay, we're going to pass a $2 trillion infrastructure bill. So what exactly does this mean for states? What's the prognosis? Well, unfortunately, my answer is it depends. I know that's not everyone's favorite answer, but I just want to be honest with you. And I say this, because it's never really clear what infrastructure entails. Are we just talking roads and transit, bridges and traffic safety issues, or is it a broader portfolio that's broadband, education, hospitals? I think that's kind of an important distinction to be made. And then kind of the other factor that is to me really important, because this one is very much a political consideration, is what does Congress choose to do with those programs that I mentioned at the start? Are we just going to add on some additional funding to those programs and then let the existing formulas send that money out to states and localities? Or is Congress going to attempt to write completely new programs? I don't think I need to kind of tell you all how difficult it can be to do to determine, okay, state X is going to get this much and state Y is going to get that much. And of course, there will be, will there be any additional aid in response to the COVID-19 pandemic? We've already seen a little bit of aid for states in response to COVID-19. So I just want to kind of close by touching on that. So if we take a quick look at some of the funding we've seen come through the COVID bills on the next slide, Doug. So in the CARES Act, which you may remember from the spring of 2020, there was about $25 billion in aid for transit. But I think it's important to know that a lot of the transit programs I mentioned earlier primarily send their funds to localities, not all, but a majority. And then the other piece of the CARES Act was about $10 billion for airports. And then in December, so not even 3 months ago, when Congress passed the $900 billion stimulus, there was actually about $10 billion specifically set aside for state DOTs. And that was to make up for lost gas tax revenues. I don't think it's a surprise to learn that gas tax revenues are actually down. People aren't going into the office, they're staying at home, so they're not buying as much gasoline. There was some additional funding for transit programs, but that was, again, allocated to localities much more so than states. So with that, Doug, those were really kind of all the topics I wanted to talk about. I know we have another kind of quick poll for folks.
Yeah, let's take the next poll. Thank you very much, Ben, for giving us the insider look. Clearly, I mean, all realms of the federal government are important to what's going on at the states. You know, one could argue that transportation, particularly important, and all these different programs and the passing down of money and where that money is passed down to and how much of a role the states play in it is such a huge consideration. And Ben does a great job and is very knowledgeable. So thanks for that, Ben. Let's take the last poll. So once again, look at the poll behind you, poll number 4. The question is, which potential federal transportation action is the most important to your state? Number 1, additional funding for transit. Number 2, additional funding for road construction. Number 3, additional funding for road maintenance. Number 4, increase the federal gasoline tax. Number 5, implement a national EV/hybrid vehicle fee. And number 6, more traffic safety funds and flexibility. So let's take a moment to see what comes in with those results. Getting a picture, people still taking it there. A lot of people talking about so right now we kind of have a 3-way tie from what I'm saying, implementing a national EV/hybrid vehicle fee. That just of course dropped down as soon as I said that. Looking like a 45% or the highest percent for number 3, which is additional funding for road maintenance, which I think probably intuitively makes sense. Number 2, additional funding for road construction is also pretty high. And I would say,
I would say to me, Doug, the obviously the top 2 are kind of going back and forth, but the key is both of those start with additional funding.
Yes,
so there's a clear desire from folks that there needs to be more money for roads, highways, transit, traffic safety issues, pedestrians, bicycles. I think that seems to be kind of the clear takeaway.
Yes, I would agree. Ben, do you have any sort of prognosis on whether you think that the STSFA, the program that helps fund states to look into road user charges, do you think that program will stick around in the next reauthorization? Is there a possibility that there could be even more money available for states?
Yeah, so I think that, I don't know if it'll keep the same name, but I think we're going to see an expansion of federal aid to states to continue, or for those states that have not begun to implement pilot programs, because I think there are a number of federal policymakers that are beginning to, for lack of a better analogy, see the writing on the wall in terms of, as vehicles become more efficient, as more electric vehicles join the fleet, that there needs to be a way to fund road transit projects that does not rely on a tax on gasoline.
Yes, exactly. And I do want to notice that there will be one more NOFO for that exact program. So keep an eye out for that. That will be coming out soon. And when it does, Ben, we'll promote it out there. I now want to ask, thank you very much, Ben, for the presentation. Let's bring in Samantha and Aaron and have I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion. Thanks a lot for joining. Everyone's on here. Samantha and Aaron, I saw that let's jump back to traffic safety real quick. I'm gonna have to get caught up on the chat Q&A, but I saw that there was a comment about automated enforcement, and there's obviously this trade-off with privacy, but then also there's this consideration of you're not necessarily using police resources, I guess, as much. And I guess it wasn't really as much of a question as a comment. So Aaron, I know you shared some resources and Samantha shared some resources, but Aaron, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about what you see about what's maybe some of the advantages of automated enforcement are in terms of what the research shows?
Yeah, I think that the thing with automated enforcement, both speed and red light cameras, is that when they are implemented correctly in a community, they're highly effective. So I shared with through the chat, the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety has done a lot of the effectiveness research around both of those topics, so red light cameras and speed cameras, and they do address also the privacy issues and concerns. I think also sometimes they, especially early in the rollout, they were seen as a revenue generator, or that's how some people viewed them. But in fact, they're the programs that put them into place correctly and also look at where they reapply the funds that they get through ticketing from red light running and speeding. When they put it back into traffic safety, that seems to increase public acceptance of the programs. So I really do encourage anyone that's interested in automated enforcement to look at the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety. Their research and their information on their website is pretty extensive, and that's a really great resource.
I appreciate that. And I know that that there was a red light camera program checklist that was also developed by, let's see, IIHS and AAA and a couple other groups. And that really gets at some of what you're talking about, Aaron, that you have to have trust in these programs, and automated enforcement. It works. It's not foolproof and there are issues with it, but the research seems to be pretty clear that these programs work and they're effective. But the trust and making sure the public believes it's actually to achieve traffic safety, and the money and all the systems and processes are kind of organized that way, is a really big piece of that. So thanks for touching on that. Ben, let me jump to you. There's a very specific question that came from Michael Syracuse, asking, the December federal COVID relief included, I don't know what this acronym is, so I hope you do, STBG money. Can this be used for projects in local jurisdictions?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. Michael, if you want to follow up with me offline, I can kind of find out exactly where you're from. Surface Transportation Block Grant is how that acronym is actually spelled out. And that program is the two things to take away from that program for folks that are hearing this for the first time is A, it is the most flexible federal program of the 5 that I mentioned at the start. And also it requires the most sub-allocation to localities.
Thank you very much, Ben. Waiting for another question coming in for you. Several, this is an interesting question, Ben, let you weigh in. Several recent DOT secretaries have had extensive relationships on the Hill. How may Secretary Buttigieg's lack of Hill relationships impact moving transportation issues forward? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too worried about that. I think the biggest question, or kind of the two biggest questions are, and this is a kind of a weedy answer here, is to what extent do the Democrats, who are the majority in both chambers, to what extent do they want to use the reconciliation process, which would allow them to pass a bill in the Senate with only 50 votes and then the vice president breaking the tie? So do they want to use that process for an infrastructure bill? Because then you essentially create fewer limits on yourself. And then the other aspect is, do we want to, or does Congress, not we, excuse me, does Congress want to fully reauthorize the FAST Act, or are they just looking to do kind of a pump up of, using existing programs and just throwing another $1 trillion or $2 trillion into that? Those are separate conversations. And I think, to your question, Representative Butler, if it is the latter, where they want to do a new reauthorization, that is where relationships are going to matter much more, because then you're coming up with potentially new programs and having to deal with the political aspects of what that entails.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Ben. Samantha, why don't I call on you? I want to ask you real quick if you could look into your crystal ball for 2021 and some of the traffic safety topics that you work on. What do you foresee? What are some of the popular kind of interventions that states are investigating at the moment to help improve traffic safety in your issue areas?
Sure. So I would definitely say that handheld bans is something that is high priority right now. There were a handful of handheld bans enacted in 2019 and 2020, and I have already seen a lot of bills introduced, about 10 bills introduced so far in 2021 that would enact handheld bans in states that haven't, that don't have enacted one. So far, there are about 25 states that have handheld bans. And like I said, there are already 10 states this year that have introduced handheld bans. Maybe another thing I have seen are laws regarding reporting and data collection. And that is something that Erin mentioned in her presentation. And this is maybe not regarding data linkage, but states are definitely looking at having more states reporting uniformly across the United States regarding alcohol and drug impaired driving, because it's essential, like for any traffic safety issue, but regarding alcohol and drug impaired driving, it's very important to have uniform reporting. And so I have seen already in 2019, several states enacting laws to collect data and to report data. In 2020, I saw less bills, but I'm definitely expecting seeing more states introducing bills to improve that issue.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to see, not exactly sure on the effectiveness of some of these handheld bans yet, but correct me if I'm wrong, Samantha, some more recent data maybe from insurance agencies and telematics are showing that maybe those policies are perhaps effective in reducing some distracted driving.
Correct. So there is not proof of the effectiveness of the laws, but there have been some studies done by the insurance industry that show that insurance policies are less costly in states that have stricter laws. And the cost is reduced because they have seen a decrease in demands. So like in claims. And so indirectly, that is sort of a proof of effectiveness of the laws. I mean, I cannot say it is, but it might be.
Yeah, I thought that was wise to put that qualifier there. Erin, I think you had something you maybe wanted to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Samantha was saying. I think one thing also to keep in mind just with impaired driving and polysubstance impaired driving is one thing that we've heard from the field over the last 5-ish years is that if you're not testing for other substances beyond alcohol, you actually don't have the full extent, you don't know the full extent of the problem. So it could be that someone who has a BAC of 0.02, 0.05, for instance, in addition has 3 or 4 different drugs on board. And so if there isn't testing to see what other drugs might be on board, you'll never know. And so one movement we've seen in some of the states is to require standardized toxicology testing of impaired drivers or those that were involved in fatal crashes. So that's something just for awareness that that will help inform decisions around policies around impaired driving.
Anything to add to that, Samantha? Thank you very much, Erin.
No, I agree with Erin. I definitely think that there is a push towards uniformization of collection of data so that there is actually, you can compare apples to apples and you know the extent of the problem.
Yep. And Erin, to your point that you made earlier that, having this data also helps you, you may treat or have different punishment or treatment or intervention for someone who was an alcohol impaired driver versus someone who is on a different drug or a combination of drugs. And until you have that full kind of suite of information, it's hard to make the right decision to get the person the help they need and also, hopefully make our roadways safer. I think that's, kind of part of what I'm hearing. Is that right, Erin?
Yeah, that's right. So if you think of substance use and substance abuse or people with substance use disorders, it's a disorder. And so there is a health aspect to that. And treating the root of the substance use disorder has implications for road safety. So we know that there are people that that are recidivism is high for people who are impaired drivers and also suffer from alcoholism or substance use disorder. So those are some, I'd like to say innovative, but they've been out for a while, but innovative policies that can be put into place for people who are are convicted of impaired driving is seeing if you can connect them to substance use or alcohol treatment programs.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. So with that, I do think have a couple more questions, but we are at time. So I want to pull up back one slide real quick so we can show everybody some of our common resources. May have trouble doing that, so may not be able to. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. I know we went over a lot of topics, and I know that can be a little bit I know that you're all feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed in the positions you're in right now, but very much know that NCSL is here to help you. Please reach out to us. Let us know about research requests. Let us know about future ideas for programming. And Ben, myself, and Samantha, and our partners at CDC, NHTSA, Federal Highways, et cetera, we're here and we're able to help. I want to give a big shout out to Samantha and Jonathan Bates and Megan McKenzie and others for helping organize this presentation. And I also want to note that this series continues throughout February. So please check back in every Friday through the rest of February and check out the 101 sessions that make sense and most relate to what you're interested in. And with that, I will sign off and thank you let's give a round of applause to Aaron, Samantha, and Ben. Thank you so much and appreciate your effort and all your hard work.
Bye, thanks, Doug.
Thank you.